The dress was too tight around her ribs. Daisy had noticed it the moment Marin's fingers pulled the laces at her back. That particular tightness that made shallow breathing feel like a luxury. She had said nothing. She had learned over the past 3 years living inside Ashvale Manor that saying nothing was the safest language available to her. Silence was armor. Silence kept her fed and housed and alive inside walls that had never once felt like home. The morning light through the chapel windows was pale and cold, the kind of gray that arrived in late autumn when the hills beyond the estate were already stripped bare. Daisy stood at the threshold of the dressing antechamber, her reflection caught in the tall, tarnished mirror across the room. She looked, she thought, like someone who had been carefully assembled to look like a bride. White linen, a veil of ivory lace, a thin coronet of dried flowers pressed flat by someone's efficient hands. Rosemary and white heather, she recognized, because her mother had once told her what those plants meant. Remembrance, protection, things that had not come. Her reflection did not look happy, but happiness, as her stepmother Lady Vessa had explained on multiple occasions with that particular tone that managed to sound gentle while landing like stone, was not the point of this arrangement. "You are an Omega of House Caldwell," Vessa had said just last evening, standing in the doorway of Daisy's small room while a servant pressed the wedding dress. "Your status makes you useful precisely once, Daisy. Do not squander it by making faces." Useful. That was the word that had followed her from childhood into womanhood. Useful, as in her blood carried the old Omega lineage, rare now, most said near extinct, which made her valuable to certain alphas, for reasons that had more to do with pack law and territorial consolidation than with any feeling resembling affection. Useful, as in she was the quiet daughter of a dead man whose title had passed not to her younger brother Colt, but to Vessa, the second wife, who had navigated the laws of Ashvale territory with the precision of someone who had studied them for years before ever becoming a widow. Daisy pressed her palm flat against her sternum. Her inner wolf, the quiet, pale thing that had always felt half asleep compared to the wolves of the other women in court, stirred faintly, not with excitement, with unease. That low, instinctive tremor that came from somewhere older than thought. She had been ignoring it for weeks. Marin appeared behind her, adjusting the veil with practiced fingers. Marin was the only servant in the manor who still looked at Daisy like she was a person. 20 years older, sharp-eyed, gray beginning at her temples. "You should eat something," she said softly. "I can't. The laces." "I know." Marin's hands paused. For just a moment, something crossed the older woman's face. Not quite sorrow, not quite warning. Something Daisy didn't have time to read before it was smoothed away. "The carriage is ready. They want you in the chapel before the guests are seated." The guests, as if it were a celebration. Daisy did not ask who would be attending. She already knew the relevant detail. The man she was being given to would be there. Lord Cedric Vane, alpha of the Ironfield pack, 43 years old, twice widowed, the second wife under circumstances that no one in polite company discussed directly, only sideways, in pauses and averted glances. He had looked at Daisy twice at the council dinner 3 months ago, both times with the flat, assessing expression of someone calculating a purchase. Vessa had stood beside her and smiled. The carriage ride to the Ashvale Chapel was 12 minutes through the cold morning. Daisy counted her breaths. Her wolf stirred again, more insistently this time, that low pull that felt less like warning and more like something trying to wake up fully, something trying to surface through the fog that had blurred her instincts for as long as she could remember. She had been told as a child, by Vessa's own physician, that her wolf was underdeveloped. A weak Omega, he had written in the record, non-threatening, docile. She had believed it long enough that it had almost become true. The chapel was old stone, smelling of cold and beeswax and the faint ghost of incense burned centuries ago. The pews filled with faces she recognized only vaguely. Council members, neighboring alphas, Vessa's social architecture on full display, flowers at the ends of each pew, white and silver, very beautiful, very cold. Daisy walked the aisle slowly, her eyes fixed on the stone floor ahead of her, rather than the faces turning to observe her progress. She was good at that, looking without being seen. Lord Cedric waited at the altar. He was broad-shouldered in formal black, his gray-streaked hair combed back, his expression the same flat calculation she remembered from the council dinner. He did not smile when she reached him. He looked at her the way someone looks at a document they are about to sign. Bishop Holt stood between them, old and deliberate, his ceremonial robes deep burgundy, the Ashvale seal embroidered on the collar. He opened the rites book with the reverence of a man who had performed this ceremony too many times to find it remarkable. And then, a sound. Not loud, not dramatic. Just the chapel doors opening again, a cold gust of autumn air rushing through the aisle, and a voice, low even, carrying the particular quality of a sound that expects to be obeyed without raising itself, speaking from the back of the room. This ceremony will not proceed. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Daisy had ever heard. She turned, along with every other person in that chapel, to look. He stood at the threshold, as if he had simply decided that was where he would be, and the world had arranged itself accordingly. Tall, broad through the shoulders, dressed in black leather and a wolf fur mantle, braided dark hair over one shoulder, his eyes pale and cold as winter stone. 2 guards flanked him, but they were not the source of the authority in the room. He was. It radiated from him the way heat radiates from a forge. Undeniably, without effort, and at a distance that warned you to be careful. Daisy did not recognize his face, but she recognized, in the marrow of something older than memory, what he was. Alpha King. She had never seen him. Theron of the Northern Crown, the Alpha King of all 7 territories, had been a name in political reports and whispered court conversations for as long as she could remember. A king who rarely appeared in person. A king who sent edicts and ambassadors and rarely lowered himself to attend the events of minor lords. He was here now. He walked the aisle without hurry, and the guests parted in the way people part for things they do not want to obstruct. Lord Cedric had gone rigid at the altar. Vessa, Daisy noticed in her peripheral vision, had turned the color of old wax. The Alpha King stopped several feet from the altar and looked, not at Cedric, not at the bishop, not at the flowers or the assembled guests, at Daisy. His gaze was direct and entirely unreadable. "Lord Vane," he said, his voice still that same quiet, carrying tone. "You are in violation of Crown Compact, Article 9. No omega of a noble bloodline may be contracted without royal witness and approval. This ceremony was registered without that approval." Cedric's jaw tightened. The Lady Vessa gave her consent as head of House Caldwell. Lady Vessa is not the head of House Caldwell. The king's voice did not rise. It simply stopped Cedric's sentence, the way a stone wall stops movement. That title belongs to the eldest child of Lord Aldrich Caldwell, which is not Lady Vessa. The chapel was perfectly still. Daisy was aware of her own heartbeat, of the dried heather in her coronet, of Marin, somewhere in the back pews, very carefully not moving. Bishop Holt cleared his throat. "Your Majesty, if you intend to interrupt the ceremony, I must ask." "I am not interrupting," the king said. "I am ending it." Then he looked at Daisy again. Not with warmth, not with anything she could easily name, just with the clear, measured attention of someone who was seeing something exactly as it was. "You are Daisy Caldwell," he said. It was not a question. But it felt like something important that her name had been said aloud in this room, by this man, in this way. Not as a thing being transferred, not as a placeholder in a contract, but as an identity, a specific person. "I am," she said. Her voice was steadier than she expected. He held her gaze for one moment longer. Then he addressed the bishop. "Record it as void." Lord Cedric stepped forward. "You cannot simply..." I can. A pause. And you will want to think very carefully about the next sentence you speak to me, Vane. Very carefully. Cedric stopped. The king turned back toward the doors, and his guards moved with him. He paused at the edge of the aisle and spoke without turning. Miss Caldwell, you will come with us. Daisy stood at the altar in her tight dress and her pressed flower coronet, the bishop's rites book still open. Cedric's fury a hot presence at her right, Vessa's silence a cold one at her left. Her wolf, for the first time in years, was fully awake. She stepped away from the altar. No one stopped her. That was the part that stayed with Daisy as she followed the Alpha King's guards down the chapel aisle and through the heavy oak doors into the cold morning. No one stopped her. Not Vessa, whose entire careful architecture had just collapsed in the span of 4 minutes. Not Cedric, who had enough political intelligence to understand that placing a hand on anyone walking beside the king's guard would be a decision with lasting consequences. Not Bishop Holt, who closed his rites book with the quiet resignation of a man who had learned to read rooms. The autumn air hit her face the moment she crossed the threshold. Cold, sharp, smelling of pine resin and wet stone and the distant wood smoke from the village beyond the hill. After the chapel's compressed silence, the outside felt enormous. Daisy stopped on the top step and breathed, a real breath, the first one in hours that wasn't rationed by the dress's laces, and felt the world tilt slightly, the way it does when something you have been braced against is suddenly removed. The king was already at the bottom of the steps. He had not looked back to confirm she was following. He simply moved with the certainty of someone who expected the world to arrange itself around his decisions. And so far, in Daisy's limited observation, it consistently did. 2 black carriages waited on the chapel road. The horses were large and dark, their breath misting in the cold air, their tack plain and well-maintained in a way that communicated quality without decoration. A 3rd guard stood at the lead carriage door. He opened it without a word as the king approached. The king stopped and turned. He looked at her standing on the chapel steps in her wedding dress and her coronet of flattened heather, and she waited for something. Pity, assessment, the particular expression men used when they believed they had done a woman a favor and expected gratitude in return. She had seen that expression often enough to recognize it from a distance. It didn't come. His face was unreadable in the way that faces are when someone has spent a long time making certain they reveal nothing by accident. His eyes, in the pale morning light, were a gray so light they were almost colorless. There was a thin scar along his jaw that she hadn't noticed inside the chapel. "The dress," he said, with the tone of someone making an observation rather than a comment. "Can you travel in it?" Daisy looked down at the white linen. "I don't have anything else." He turned to one of the guards and said something low. The guard moved to the 2nd carriage. A moment later he returned with a folded wool cloak, dark charcoal gray, plain and heavy. He held it toward Daisy without ceremony. She took it. It smelled of cedar and cold air, and something faintly smoky, like a fire that had burned down hours ago. She pulled it around her shoulders and felt immediately less exposed, less like a thing that had been prepared for display. "Thank you," she said. The king nodded once, as if acknowledgement were sufficient, and gestured toward the carriage. She climbed in. He did not ride with her. He took the 2nd carriage with 2 of his guards. She sat alone in the 1st with a single guard across from her, a young woman, dark-braided, in the same plain black as the others, who kept her eyes forward and did not attempt conversation. Daisy was grateful for that. She did not think she was capable of conversation. The carriage moved north. Through the small window, she watched Ashvale's gray rooftops recede and tried to organize what had just happened into something that made sense. The king had come to the chapel. He had cited Crown Compact Law, Article 9, which she had never heard of, which meant either it was obscure or she had been deliberately kept ignorant of it, and she suspected the latter. He had declared the ceremony void. He had known her name and her bloodline. He had arrived precisely on time. Precisely. She pressed her back against the carriage wall and watched the forest begin outside the window, pine and bare oak and the occasional flash of frost on the grass. He had not arrived by chance. No one arrived at a chapel at precisely the right moment by chance, which meant he had known about the ceremony in advance, which meant he had sources inside Ashvale territory, which meant he had been watching something, or someone, long enough to act at the right moment. Why? That was the question that settled in her chest and refused to leave. Not gratitude, not relief. Those would come later, perhaps, when her hands stopped trembling. Right now. Why? Why would the Alpha King of the Northern Crown involve himself in the contracted marriage of a minor lord and an Omega from a secondary noble house? What was Daisy Caldwell to a king who had 7 territories and a court full of actual political concerns? Article 9. Omega of noble bloodline. No royal witness. She turned the words over carefully. The law existed, clearly, and Vesa had violated it. But laws like that were violated quietly every day in territories where the crown's attention was elsewhere. The violation alone was not reason enough for the king to come in person. There was something else. She was still turning it over when the carriages stopped. Not at a city. Not at a castle. At a way station. A large, solidly built stone structure off the main road, surrounded by a low wall, smoke rising from 2 chimneys. The kind of place used by crown couriers and military escorts, not built for comfort, but built to last. A stable to one side, a well in the yard. 2 guards already stationed at the gate, who straightened and stepped aside as the carriages entered. The king was already out of his carriage by the time Daisy descended from hers. He spoke briefly to the station keeper, a stocky older man who bowed with the practiced efficiency of someone who had received royal visits before, and then turned to address Daisy directly for the first time since the chapel steps. "We stop here until evening. There is a room for you on the upper floor. Food will be brought." He paused. "You are not a prisoner. The door does not lock from the outside." Daisy looked at him steadily. "Then what am I?" Something shifted in his expression. Not much. A slight change around the eyes, the quality of attention rather than its direction. "At present," he said, "you are someone the crown has an obligation to. The details of that obligation will be explained tonight." "By you?" "Yes." She studied him for a moment. He did not look away. He did not fill the silence with reassurance or additional explanation, and she found, strangely, that she trusted the silence more than she would have trusted either of those things. "All right," she said. The room upstairs was small and clean. A narrow bed with wool blankets, a washstand with a ceramic basin, a single window overlooking the yard. No decoration. No attempt at comfort beyond the functional. A fire had been lit in the small hearth, and the room was warm. Someone had left a folded set of plain clothes on the chair beside the bed. A linen underdress, a heavy wool dress in dark brown, a belt, and thick stockings. All the right approximate size. Again. Prepared. Daisy sat on the edge of the bed and pressed her palms against her knees, and made herself breathe slowly. Her wolf moved beneath the surface of her calm. Not anxious now, but alert. Awake in a way it hadn't been in years, as if something in the air of this place had reminded it of something older. She changed out of the wedding dress. She folded it with the automatic neatness of someone who had spent years tidying after herself in a house that treated her like a guest who hadn't quite earned her room. She set it on the floor in the corner. She put on the plain wool dress. She unbraided her hair and combed it with her fingers and rebraided it, tighter and lower, the way she wore it when she wanted to feel less ceremonial and more like herself. Then she sat by the window and waited. Food came. Bread, hard cheese, a bowl of thick lentil soup, a cup of something warm and herbal that wasn't quite tea, but had the same settling effect. She ate all of it, which surprised her. She hadn't thought she was hungry. Outside, the afternoon light shifted through the yard. She watched the guards change posts. She watched one of the horses be walked in a slow circle by a young stable hand. She watched the king cross the yard below, his wolf fur mantle gone now, his leather vest and the 2 crossed straps of his harness visible, moving with that same unhurried authority that seemed to require no effort from him. He paused in the yard and looked up at the window. He didn't wave, didn't nod, just confirmed in a single glance that she was there. Then he went inside. At some point the light softened toward evening, and Daisy was still sitting by the window when footsteps came up the staircase, deliberate, measured, and stopped outside the door. A knock. One. Not a formality. An actual knock, the kind that waits. "Come in," she said. The door opened. Theron stepped inside and remained near the threshold, not advancing into the room, which she noticed. He looked at her by the window, her plain dress, her rebraided hair, the folded wedding gown in the corner, and said nothing for a moment. "You want to know why," he said finally. "I want to know everything," Daisy said. "But yes, start with why." He moved to the chair across the room, not near her, not looming, just settling into the space with the same economy he seemed to apply to everything, and sat. "Your father," he said, "did not die of a fever." The fire crackled. Outside, the wind moved through the pines. Daisy's hands folded in her lap went very still. "Tell me," she said quietly. And he did. Her father had been poisoned. Theron said it plainly without softening the edges, and Daisy found she was grateful for that too, the same way she had been grateful for the silence in the yard, for the knock that waited. He spoke like someone who believed she was capable of hearing the truth without being managed around it. Lord Aldrich Caldwell had not weakened and died over the course of a slow winter illness 3 years ago. He had been given something, a compound that mimicked the symptoms of lung fever with enough precision to satisfy a physician who was not looking for anything else. A physician who, Theron said, had been paid to not look for anything else. The compound was rare, expensive, and known almost exclusively in the Northern Territories, where certain healers had documented its properties in texts that were not widely circulated outside Crown libraries. Crown libraries. That was how they had found it. Not immediately. It had taken nearly 2 years after Lord Aldrich's death for a Crown investigator to connect a pattern of similar deaths in 3 separate territories. Minor lords, noble bloodlines, all with Omega lineage in the family, all with second spouses who had subsequently assumed control of the household. "Vessa," Daisy said. "Vessa did not act alone," Theron said. "She was the instrument in Asheville. Lord Cedric Vane was the architect." The fire shifted and settled. Daisy looked at the wall beyond his shoulder and let that arrange itself inside her, the shape of it, the dimensions. Cedric had not simply wanted a contracted arrangement with an Omega. He had helped construct the conditions that made the arrangement possible. Her father's illness, the transfer of the household title to Vessa, the 3 years of careful isolation, of being made useful and small and manageable, all of it built piece by piece to deliver her to that altar. "Why?" she asked. "What was the point of going to all of that trouble? He could have contracted any Omega." "He could have," Theron agreed, "but not one with your specific bloodline." He leaned forward slightly, not toward her, just forward, the posture of someone moving into the clearer part of an explanation. "House Caldwell holds a dormant territorial charter," he said. "Your great-grandmother's time. A document that grants its bearer the right to claim the Ashevale Valley and the 3 water routes that run through it, independent of standard pack law. That charter cannot be transferred, sold, or seized. It can only pass through blood inheritance, specifically through the female line of the Caldwell Omega lineage." Daisy was quiet for a moment. "Through me. Through you, or through any children you produced inside a legally binding union with a recognized alpha, which is what Vane intended to become. The full shape of it arrived then, cold and complete. Cedric had not wanted her. He had wanted the charter. He had needed her blood, her name, her legal signature on a union document. And he had needed Vesa to control her long enough to get all three without resistance. The contracted marriage had not been a transaction. It had been the final step in a years-long theft, built on her father's grave. She pressed her palms flat against her thighs and breathed. "My brother," she said. "Colt." Something in Theron's expression shifted. Careful. The way someone looks when they are about to say something they know will hurt, and have decided honesty is still the right choice. "Where is he?" she asked. "Colt Caldwell was sent to the Fenwick border garrison 18 months ago," Theron said. "Registered as a voluntary military placement. The documentation bears his signature." "He was 15, Daisy said. Her voice was very flat. "Yes." "He didn't sign anything voluntarily." "No," Theron said. "He didn't." She stood up, not dramatically. She simply could not remain seated. She moved to the window and looked out at the dark yard below, the torches lit now along the station wall, the horses quiet in the stable. Her reflection was faint in the glass. A woman in a borrowed wool dress with her hair in a plain braid, standing in a waystation room, learning the full dimensions of what had been done to her family. Her wolf was not trembling now. It was very still, the particular stillness of something that has finished being afraid and started being something else entirely. "Is he alive?" she asked. "As of 6 weeks ago, yes. My investigators confirmed it." "Is he safe?" A pause. "Honest." "The Fenwick garrison is a hard posting. He is alive and functional. Whether he is well is a different question." She turned from the window. "I want him back." "I know," Theron said. "That isn't a request," she said. "I'm telling you what I intend to do. Whatever you need from me, whatever obligation the Crown has decided it has regarding my bloodline and that charter, I need my brother returned. That is not negotiable." He looked at her for a long moment. His expression was, as usual, difficult to read in its specific contents, but the quality of it was not dismissive, not calculating in the way Cedric's had been. It was more like someone reading carefully, someone taking accurate measure. "Retrieving Colt Caldwell from Fenwick is already part of the Crown's plan," he said. "It was part of it before today." She studied him. "How long have you been planning this?" 7 months. 7 months. She had spent 7 months inside Ashvale Manor being fitted for a wedding dress and practicing how to sit correctly at formal dinners. And somewhere in the Northern Court, a king had been building a case. The strangeness of that, the simultaneity of her helplessness and his invisible intervention, was difficult to fully absorb. "You could have come sooner," she said. It came out with more edge than she had intended. He didn't flinch. "I could not act without documentation sufficient to hold in Crown Court. Moving before that would have given Vane the legal ground to contest, and he has enough allies in the Eastern Territories to make a contested case dangerous for you. I needed it to be irrefutable." "So you waited until the altar." "I waited until the moment the evidence was complete and the action was irreversible." A pause. "I understand that distinction is of limited comfort." "It is of no comfort," she said. "No," he agreed. "I imagine not." The honesty of that landed differently than an apology would have. She stood by the window and looked at him, and tried to work out what exactly she was dealing with. He had done something that had required significant resources and careful timing. He had done it legally, strategically, effectively. He had not done it in a way that centered her feelings about it, or that required her gratitude. He had done it as if it were a thing that needed doing, and he was the person with the authority and the means to do it. She didn't know what to do with that. "What happens now?" she asked. "Tomorrow we ride for Carehold," he said. "Carehold, the Northern Crown seat, 2 days north. You will be placed under Crown protection while the legal case against Vane and Lady Vesa is formalized. Your status as rightful head of House Caldwell will be officially recorded. The dormant charter will be acknowledged in your name. And Colt. A rider has already been dispatched to Fenwick. He should arrive at Carehold within a fortnight. She absorbed that. A fortnight. 14 days. After 18 months. And what does the crown want in return? She asked. Because there was always something. She had grown up inside enough political architecture to know that interventions did not come without shape. For the first time, something crossed his face that was not quite the careful neutrality he had maintained throughout the conversation. Not discomfort, something more like precision, the look of someone choosing their words with specific care. The charter, he said, in your name, legally recorded, ends the dispute over the Asheville water routes and stabilizes the eastern boundary of Crown territory. That is what the Crown gains. Legally and politically. That's not what I asked, Daisy said. The faint shift again. No, it isn't. He stood, and he was taller standing than she had recalibrated for, the kind of presence that didn't announce itself but was simply there, like a structural wall. He moved toward the door, paused with his hand on the frame. There is a second matter, he said, one that is not political. I will not discuss it tonight. Why not? Because you have received enough information for one evening, he said. And because the second matter requires that you be rested and clear-headed when we discuss it, not because I need you manageable, but because you will want to be. Daisy looked at him steadily. That sounds like something someone says when the second matter is something I won't like. It is something you will not know what to do with, he said. That is different from not liking it. He left. The door did not lock. She stood in the middle of the small warm room for a long time after his footsteps had descended the stairs. Her wolf moved slowly beneath her calm. Not urgent, not afraid, but oriented. The way a compass needle orients when it finally gets close enough to north to stop drifting. She did not sleep well, but she slept. And in the hour before dawn, she had a dream. She was standing in a stone hall she had never seen. High arched ceilings, torchlight on gray walls, a long table with maps spread across it. The air smelled of pine resin and cold metal. Across the table stood a figure she couldn't clearly see. But she knew, the way you know things in dreams without seeing them, that it was important, that something had been decided, that a line had been crossed that could not be uncrossed. She woke with the dream still present, vivid and strange, and lay still in the gray early light and thought about the second matter, and about a king who knocked before entering. Carehold arrived on the second evening like a wall of dark stone rising from the tree line. Daisy had traveled before, short distances, supervised, always within the borders of Asheville territory. She had never seen the Northern Crown's seat. She had imagined something imposing and cold, all sharpened towers and intimidation architecture. What she saw instead was something older and more serious than that, a fortress built into the face of a granite ridge, its walls the same gray as the stone behind it, so that at a distance it appeared to grow from the mountain rather than having been placed upon it. Torches burned along the outer wall in long rows. The gates were iron and oak, enormous, and opened without ceremony as the carriages approached, as if Carehold had simply been waiting. Inside the walls, the yard was wide and functional. Stable blocks, armory, a great hall whose arched windows glowed amber from within. Servants moved efficiently between buildings. Guards stood at regular intervals, their posture attentive but not rigid. The whole place had the feeling of something that had been running well for a very long time and expected to continue. Daisy descended from the carriage and stood in the yard with the cold mountain air on her face, and felt, for the first time, something she cautiously identified as solid ground. A woman met them at the hall steps, middle-aged, gray-streaked hair pinned back, wearing a dark dress, and the expression of someone whose time was organized to the quarter hour. She introduced herself as Senna, the household steward, and directed Daisy inside with the practical warmth of someone who had arranged arrivals for decades and considered comfort a logistical matter rather than an emotional one. "Your rooms are prepared," Senna said, moving through the corridor with the efficiency of someone who had memorized the building's geography. "Warm bath, fresh clothes, dinner when you're ready. There's no schedule tonight." She glanced sideways at Daisy. "You've had a considerable few days." "That's one way to describe it," Daisy said. Something like approval crossed Senna's face. "Good. You'll need that." The rooms were on the upper east side of the hall. 2 connected chambers, a sitting room with a fireplace and a writing desk, a sleeping room with a wide bed and wool hangings in deep green. Simple, well-made, the kind of rooms that communicated permanence rather than guest status. A copper bathtub had been filled near the bedroom hearth. Clothes were laid out. Practical things, good quality, her approximate size again. Someone at Carehold had been doing careful work before she arrived. She bathed. She ate alone in the sitting room. Roast meat, root vegetables, dark bread, a cup of spiced cider, and felt the 2 days of travel settle out of her body. She was still working through everything Theron had told her at the way station, still turning the shape of it in her hands like a stone with an uneven surface. Her father's murder, the charter, Colt, the case being built over 7 months, the second matter. He had not mentioned it again during the 2-day ride. She had not asked. They had traveled mostly separately. He with his senior guards, she in the first carriage, and the few times they had stopped and been in proximity, he had spoken practically. Road conditions, estimated arrival time, whether she needed anything. Not unfriendly, not warm. Measured. She was beginning to understand that measured was simply how he operated, and that it was not the same as indifference. On the second morning of travel, at a rest stop where the horses were watered and bread and dried fruit were passed around, she had found herself standing near him at the edge of the road, while both of them looked at the tree line without speaking. It had not been uncomfortable, which surprised her. She was accustomed to silences that required management. His silences required nothing. They simply existed, and you could stand inside them without performing anything. She had thought about saying something. She hadn't. He had handed her a piece of dried apple from the provisions without comment, and she had taken it, and they had stood there for another 3 minutes before the horses were ready. She fell asleep that second night at Carehold, with the fire burning low and the mountain wind moving against the shuttered windows, and she slept deeply and without dreams. In the morning, Senna arrived with a schedule. The legal proceedings, it turned out, had already begun. A Crown advocate named Drest, angular, ink-stained, precise, met with Daisy in the hall's small study and spent 2 hours walking through the evidence compiled against Cedric Vane and Lady Vessa. She listened carefully and answered his questions with the focused attention of someone taking an inventory. Yes, she recognized her brother's name in the garrison document. No, she had never given consent for that placement. Yes, she could confirm the timeline of her father's illness. No, she had not been informed of the territorial charter's existence until 4 days ago. That last answer made Drest pause, his quill hovering. "You were never told," he said. "No. Lady Vessa never mentioned." "Lady Vessa," Daisy said carefully, "told me that my primary value to the family was being cooperative and not making faces." Drest looked at her for a moment, then wrote something down with the particular precision of someone noting something important. The formal documentation took most of the morning. By early afternoon, Daisy had signed her name to 7 separate legal declarations, her signature small and exact, a habit formed during years of careful invisibility, and the Crown advocate had gathered his papers with the satisfied air of a man whose case had just become significantly stronger. She was walking back from the study through the main corridor when she encountered Theron. He was coming from the direction of the armory, his outer mantle absent, a rolled map under one arm, speaking quietly with a guard who peeled away as Daisy approached. He stopped when he saw her. "The advocate finished?" he asked. "Yes." She fell into step beside him, without quite deciding to, moving in the same direction down the corridor. He seemed pleased. "He should be. Your testimony closes the last gap in the property case." I want to be in the courtroom, she said. When it proceeds. He glanced at her. It won't be a comfortable proceeding. I didn't ask for comfortable, she said. I asked to be present. A pause. Granted. They walked in silence for a few steps. Stone corridor, torchlight, the smell of old wood and cold air. She was aware of the difference in their height, the different rhythm of their steps, the way the guards they passed all straightened slightly as Theron went by, and then resumed their posture once he had passed. You said there was a second matter, she said. I did. We're both rested and clear-headed. He stopped walking. They were in a corridor intersection, a tall window at the end, letting in flat gray daylight. He turned to face her with that same quality of full attention she had noticed in the chapel, the sense of being seen with accuracy rather than with agenda. The dormant charter, he said, is not the only thing your bloodline carries. She waited. Omega bloodlines of the old noble houses, he said, were documented in the crown records for a reason that goes beyond territorial rights. 300 years ago, when the 7 territories were unified under a single crown for the first time, the founding compact required something beyond political agreement. He paused. It required a blood acknowledgement, a witness declaration, recorded under crown law, between the ruling alpha of each founding house and an omega heir of equal standing. Not a contract, not a transaction, a recognized bond of house to crown. Daisy was very still. What does that mean in practical terms? It means that House Caldwell's standing in the compact, its legal weight, its vote in the Crown Council, its ability to function as a sovereign house rather than a subordinate one, requires the acknowledgement to be renewed in each generation. He held her gaze. It has not been renewed since your grandmother's time. The house has been functioning on borrowed standing. Vane knew this. Part of why he wanted the union was to use the contractual marriage to substitute for the proper acknowledgement, a legal loophole that would have given him the charter and collapsed the house's independent standing in the same move. Collapsed it into his, Daisy said. Yes. She absorbed that. The full design of what Cedric had built was even larger than she had understood. Not just the charter, the whole house. And to renew it properly, she said slowly. What does that require? Theron was quiet for a moment. It requires, he said, a formal acknowledgement between the head of House Caldwell and the ruling alpha of the Northern Crown. Witnessed, documented, legally binding. Daisy looked at him. He looked back. The gray daylight fell between them from the window at the end of the hall. Somewhere below, in the yard, a horse shifted, and a guard called something to another guard, and the ordinary sounds of the fortress went on as they always did. You, she said. It was not a question. Me, he said. She turned and looked at the wall for a moment. Not away from him, just at the stone, at the torchlight, at the practical, ancient architecture of the place, while she organized what she felt about this into something that wasn't just noise. This is why you came to the chapel, she said, not only for the law violation. The law violation was real and it needed to be stopped regardless, he said. But yes, you are the last Omega heir of a founding house. The compact acknowledgement cannot be completed with anyone else. And if Vane had completed that union before I could intervene, the acknowledgement would have been permanently inaccessible. House Caldwell would have ceased to exist as a sovereign entity within the generation. And the crown needs the house. The compact needs the house, he corrected. The 7-house compact is what keeps the territories from returning to independent war. Lose one founding house's standing, and the structure weakens. Lose it to a man like Vane, with Eastern allies and territorial ambitions, and the structure doesn't weaken. It fractures. She turned back to face him. He had not moved. He was standing in the intersection of the corridor with the same quiet stillness he seemed to carry everywhere, and she was looking at him with new geometry. Not the king who had stopped a wedding, not the man who had knocked before entering, but someone whose careful 7-month work had had stakes she was only now fully measuring. "And what does this acknowledgement involve?" she asked, specifically. "A formal ceremony," he said, "witnessed by the Crown Council, a spoken declaration, recorded in the compact register, a shared seal." He paused. "It is not a marriage. It does not obligate you to Carehold or to me beyond the legal standing it creates for your house. You would return to Ashvale as its rightful head. The house's seat on the Crown Council would be restored. Your sovereignty would be documented and protected. But it requires my willing participation." "It requires your willing participation," he confirmed. "I will not compel it. If you refuse, I will still pursue the case against Vane and Vesa on criminal grounds. The charter returns to you either way. The compact acknowledgement is separate." She studied him for a long moment. "Why are you telling me I can refuse?" she asked. "Because you can," he said simply. She did not give him an answer that day. He did not ask for one. That, she was learning, was consistent with how he operated. He presented things with full clarity and then gave them room to exist without pressure. It should have felt strategic. Somehow it didn't. It felt like the behavior of someone who had decided a long time ago that forcing outcomes produced worse results than waiting for honest ones, and had built his entire manner around that conclusion. Daisy spent 2 days thinking. She walked the corridors of Carehold. She sat in the library with its floor-to-ceiling shelves and its smell of old parchment and linseed oil. She read what she could find about the founding compact and the seven-house structure and the history of Omega noble lineages, which turned out to be more documented than she had ever been allowed to know. She had been kept deliberately ignorant. That was clear now, reading these records. What she was, what her bloodline actually meant in the structure of the territories, was not a small thing that Vesa had simply neglected to mention. It was a significant thing that Vesa had actively concealed, because a Daisy who understood her own standing was a Daisy who could not be managed. On the third day, a rider arrived from Fenwick. Senna found her in the library and told her simply and directly, which Daisy appreciated. She was on her feet before Senna finished the sentence. Colt was in the yard. He was taller than she remembered. 18 months did that, especially to a boy who had been 15 and was now closer to 17, and who had apparently spent those months doing the physical labor of a border garrison. He was thinner than he should have been, and there was a set to his jaw that hadn't been there before, a particular kind of guardedness that Daisy recognized because she had worn it herself. He was standing in the middle of the yard with a travel pack at his feet, and a wary expression on his face, looking at Carehold's walls like someone who had learned to be skeptical of large buildings and the people who owned them. He saw her, and went absolutely still. She crossed the yard at something faster than walking, and stopped in front of him and looked at his face. The familiar lines of it, their father's brow, their mother's mouth, and felt something that had been wound very tight inside her chest for a very long time simply release. "Daisy," he said. His voice had dropped since she last heard it. It cracked slightly on her name. "I know," she said. "I know. Come here." She did not cry in the yard. She waited until they were inside, in the sitting room of her chambers, with the door closed and the fire going, and then she sat on the edge of the chair and pressed her hands over her face for 30 seconds, while Colt sat across from her and didn't say anything, which was the right thing to do. He had always been perceptive that way, even as a child. Then she straightened up and looked at him. "Tell me everything," she said. He did. The garrison posting had been brutal in the specific way that postings designed to break young men were brutal. Not dramatic violence, but grinding hardship, deliberate isolation. Letters that he later learned had never been sent or received because someone at the Ashvale end had been intercepting them. He had believed for months that Daisy had not written. That the family had simply decided he was gone and moved on. That belief had done more damage than the physical labor. "I wrote to you every week," she said. He looked at the fire. "I know that now. Every week, Colt. Every single week." He nodded, not quite trusting his face, and she let it rest there for a moment before she told him the rest. What she had learned. Their father, Vesa, Cedric. the charter, the full architecture of what had been done and why. She told him all of it, plainly, without softening it, because he was not a child who needed protection from the truth. He was a young man who had been treated as disposable and deserved to understand by whom and why. By the end, his jaw was very tight and his eyes were very clear. "What happens to them?" he asked. "The Crown Court proceeds next week," she said. "I'll be there." "I want to be there too." "You will be," she said. The Crown Court convened on a cold morning 8 days after Daisy's arrival at Carehold. The council chamber was a long, high-ceilinged room with stone walls and a raised dais at one end, where the Crown Advocate presented the case with the methodical precision of a man who had organized 7 months of evidence into an irrefutable sequence. Daisy sat in the witness position when called and answered every question in the same flat, clear voice she had used in the small study. She did not perform distress. She did not perform dignity. She simply spoke accurately, which turned out to be the most powerful thing available to her. Cedric Vane was present, flanked by his own advocates, wearing an expression that had evolved from contempt to calculation to something that sat closer to fear as the morning progressed. Lady Vessa sat 3 seats away from him. They had clearly decided not to present a unified front, each hoping to minimize by distance. And Daisy looked at her stepmother once, directly, long enough to make certain Vessa knew she had been seen, and then looked away and did not look back. The physician who had attended her father's final illness, a man named Taub, now considerably less well compensated than he had been in Vessa's employment, had been located by Crown investigators in a coastal town 3 territories away. His written testimony, read aloud by Drest, was specific and damning. The compound, the dosage, the deliberate misdiagnosis, the payment. Cedric's advocate attempted 3 separate procedural challenges. Theron, seated on the dais as presiding authority, declined all 3 with the same measured tone and the same absence of drama. By afternoon, the findings were recorded. Lord Cedric Vane, stripped of his title, his territorial holdings returned to Crown management pending redistribution, removed from all council positions, exiled to the outer territories under Crown supervision for a period of not less than 20 years. Lady Vessa Caldwell, stripped of the fraudulently assumed title, removed from Ashvale Manor, her personal assets frozen pending review for their role in the compound procurement and the falsified garrison documents. The Ashvale estate and the Caldwell territorial charter, formally and irrevocably recorded in the name of Daisy Caldwell, head of House Caldwell, with full sovereign standing under Crown compact law. Daisy sat with the proclamation in her hands, the official document, the Crown seal in deep red wax at the bottom, and felt the weight of it. Not the triumph she had expected to feel. Something quieter and more permanent. A door that had been locked for 3 years, unlocked. Colt sat beside her. She felt him exhale. She found Theron that evening on the battlements. He was standing at the outer wall, looking north toward the ridgeline, his wolf fur mantle back on against the cold. The sky was clear, and the stars were very bright above the mountains, the kind of clear that only came when the temperature was dropping seriously. She pulled her cloak tighter and came to stand beside him, and he turned his head slightly to acknowledge her presence without speaking. They stood like that for a moment. "I've made a decision," she said. "I know," he said. She looked at him sideways. "You don't know what it is." "I have a reasonable estimate. Then you can wait 30 seconds for me to say it properly." Something crossed his face. That faint shift she had been learning to read, the one that meant something close to amusement but filtered through a man who had spent a long time keeping his expression neutral. She turned to face the ridge. "I'll complete the compact acknowledgement," she said. "Not because the Crown needs it, although I understand that it does. Not because it protects my house's standing, although it does that too." She paused. "Because it's what my father's house deserves. What he deserved. What it should have been all along, before Vessa and Cedric built their structure around preventing it. I want it done correctly, and on record and witnessed, so that no one can ever again treat House Caldwell as something that can be quietly dismantled." She looked at him. And, she said more quietly, because I trust you to stand in that ceremony as someone who means what he says, which is not a small thing, given recent events. Theron looked at her for a long moment. His pale eyes in the starlight were very steady. It is not a small thing, he agreed. I will not treat it as one. Good. She turned back to the mountains. He remained beside her, and neither of them spoke for a while, and the cold came down from the ridge and the torches burned along the wall below, and Carehold was solid and old and still around them. Colt wants to study, she said eventually. He mentioned the Crown Library. The library is open to him. He also said something about the armory. The armory has a training master. She nodded. He'll need time. He has it. She absorbed that, the simple, unqualified availability of it. Time, space, no conditions attached. The compact acknowledgement took place 10 days later, in the council chamber, with all 7 Crown witnesses present and the register open on the dais. It was formal and precise, and entirely without excess. They stood across the table from each other, which felt correct, not beside each other, not facing each other in the way of a ceremony designed to perform union, but across, like 2 people completing a document of mutual standing. Drest read the declaration aloud. They each spoke the response in turn. The seal was pressed in the register beside both their names. It took 11 minutes. After, when the witnesses had signed and the chamber had cleared, and she and Theron were the last 2 people in the room, he looked at her across the table, the register still open between them, the candles burning in their iron holders, and said nothing. She said nothing either. But she stayed at the table for a moment longer than necessary, and so did he. And that felt like the beginning of something honest. Not a promise, not a declaration, just 2 people who had looked at each other clearly, in the worst possible circumstances, and found that what they saw was something real. In the months that followed, Daisy returned to Ashvale. Not as a guest. Not as someone's arrangement. As its head. She rode through the estate gates on a gray morning with Colt beside her, and Marin waiting in the yard, older, relieved, her sharp eyes bright, and the household assembled in the honest, quiet order of a place being returned to its proper shape. She rebuilt it carefully. She learned the estate's finances, which were in worse shape than she had imagined, and better shape than she had feared. She restored the staff that Vesa had reduced. She opened the estate's records and found, buried in her father's old correspondence, 7 years of letters he had written to the Crown Advocate's office regarding the compact acknowledgement, letters that had been intercepted, held, and never delivered. She added them to the Crown record herself. Colt healed slowly, the way young people heal when given enough room and enough constancy, not all at once, not without setbacks, but genuinely. He was serious and perceptive, and had their father's particular way of sitting very still when he was thinking hard. By spring he had filled out, found his laugh again, and was spending significant time in the estate's library with texts Daisy suspected had arrived from Carehold's collection. Theron came to Ashvale twice that year. Not with ceremony, not with the full weight of the Crown entourage, with 4 guards and a practical purpose each time. Council business involving the water routes, documentation for the compact register. He stayed 2 days on the first visit, 3 on the second. He ate dinner at the estate table. He spoke with Colt about the armory texts. He walked the grounds with Daisy in the mornings, without requiring that the walks mean anything specific, which meant they came to mean something gradually and honestly. On his second visit, the last evening before he rode north again, they sat by the library fire with the estate accounts spread between them. She had asked his opinion on a territorial boundary question genuinely, and at some point the accounts were no longer the point, and the fire had burned low, and they were simply talking, the way people talk when they have stopped performing anything at all. She thought, in that moment, about the altar. About the dress that had been too tight, and the coronet of flattened heather, and the bishop's rites book, open to a page that had never been completed. about how close it had all come to being something else entirely. "My father would have liked you," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "That is the kindest thing you have said to me. Don't let it go to your head." The shift in his expression, that filtered amusement, familiar now, was something she had quietly stopped trying to suppress her own response to. He left the next morning. She stood in the yard and watched the carriages go north, and felt the particular quality of an absence that already had a return date, which was entirely different from the quality of loss. House Caldwell's seat on the Crown Council was formally reinstated at the Winter Assembly. Daisy attended. She sat in her house's chair, empty for 3 years, dusty with disuse, now polished and set in its proper position, and looked at the assembled council and the crown dais, and the faces of the lords who had watched her be prepared for an altar, and done nothing. And she was perfectly composed and entirely present, and she said what needed saying when her house was addressed, and she voted on what needed voting, and she drove home through the winter dark, with Colt beside her, and Marin asleep across the seat, and the estate lantern lit in the distance like something waiting. She was 24 years old. She had her father's house, her brother home, her name in the proper records, and the absolute certainty that she would never again be handed to anyone. Whatever came next, she would walk into it upright and clear-eyed. She already was.